Careful where you stand, Logan Whitmore said with a smirk, tilting his glass just enough for a ribbon of deep red wine to spill down the front of Naomi Carter's white silk dress. The sound wasn't loud, just a soft splash against fabric, but in a Manhattan ballroom charging $5,000 a plate, it landed like a gunshot. Conversations thinned. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above tables dressed in ivory linen. A string quartet continued playing near the balcony, but even the violins seemed to hesitate. Logan didn't. He leaned back in his chair, blonde hair perfectly styled, tuxedo tailored within an inch of arrogance, and laughed. His parents followed. Richard Whitmore's chuckle was low and practiced, the kind of laugh a man gives when he's never been told no. Victoria Whitmore covered her mouth politely, though her eyes never left the red stain spreading across Naomi's dress. Around them, investors glanced over their shoulders. Some frowned. Some smiled nervously. A few reached for their phones. Naomi Carter did not move. At 42, she had mastered stillness the way some people master volume. She stood in 3-inch heels, shoulders squared, hands resting lightly at her sides, as if wine cascading down her dress was merely rain on glass. She did not gasp. She did not raise her voice. She did not look for napkins. She simply looked at Logan. And that was when the room shifted. Because there is something unsettling about a person who refuses to react the way you expect. Logan mistook her silence for embarrassment. Relax, he added, waving his glass casually. Dry cleaners exist. A few guests at nearby tables let out restrained laughs. Victoria leaned toward a woman seated beside her and whispered, not quite softly enough. Some people just don't know how to navigate rooms like this. Naomi heard it. She heard all of it. The ballroom was the Crown Meridian, 38 stories above Midtown, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the Hudson River glowing under city lights. Tonight's event was an exclusive investor gala celebrating a proposed expansion of Whitmore Industries into renewable energy infrastructure. The deal on the table was valued at $650 million. It was the largest private capital infusion the company had ever pursued. And Logan Whitmore had just poured Cabernet Sauvignon on the woman, deciding whether that infusion would happen. He didn't know that yet. No one at the table did. Naomi had arrived alone. No assistant. No press. No security detail shadowing her steps. She wore a simple white silk gown, understated diamond studs, and a slim gold bracelet. No logos. No flashing signals of wealth. She had learned long ago that people reveal themselves faster when they think you don't matter. Richard Whitmore cleared his throat and leaned forward, his cufflinks glinting under chandelier light. "Miss," he said with a tone polished by decades of boardrooms, "I'm sure this was an accident. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at another table." Another table. Not leave, exactly. Just relocate. Quietly. Gracefully. Without making trouble. Naomi's gaze moved from Logan to Richard. She recognized him instantly. 71 years old. Self-made billionaire by inheritance and mergers. Known for strategic acquisitions and ruthless efficiency. Tonight, he wore a midnight blue tuxedo and the expression of a man accustomed to rooms bending around him. "I'm comfortable right here," Naomi said, her voice even, measured, unhurried. It carried without needing to rise. Logan scoffed. "You're literally dripping," he replied, gesturing toward her dress. "You might want to handle that before it stains." Naomi glanced down briefly. The red against white was dramatic, almost artistic. Then she looked back up. "It already has," she said calmly. A young associate from an investment firm across the table shifted in his seat. His name was Ethan Brooks. 29. Harvard MBA. He had studied quarterly reports all week preparing for tonight. He had also studied the list of potential funding partners. When he looked at Naomi more closely, something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. He leaned toward Logan, lowering his voice. "You might want to check." Logan cut him off with a wave. "I think we're fine," he said. Victoria reached for a napkin and extended it halfway toward Naomi, then stopped short as if reconsidering. "It's unfortunate," she said, her smile thin. "Events like this have certain standards." Standards. The word hung in the air. Naomi let it settle. She had been 16 the first time she heard that word used like a border fence. A country club in North Carolina. Her father had saved for months to attend a charity auction. They had been asked, gently but firmly, to confirm their membership status at the door. They didn't have one. They left quietly, She remembered the look on her father's face more than the words. That look had followed her into every boardroom since. The quartet resumed full tempo. Glasses clinked. Waiters moved cautiously around the tension like sailors steering through fog. Naomi reached into her clutch and removed her phone. No rush. No drama. She unlocked it with a single touch and scrolled. Logan rolled his eyes. "Are you texting about the dry cleaning bill?" he asked, smirking. A few more guests turned their chairs subtly toward the scene. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had seen that face before, not in person, but in financial publications, on the cover of Forbes 2 years ago under the headline, "The Quiet Architect of Capital." Naomi Carter, founder and CEO of Carter Global Holdings. Portfolio spanning energy, logistics, and infrastructure. Net worth estimated at $3.2 billion. Lead negotiator on the Whitmore expansion deal. Ethan swallowed. "Logan," he said more urgently now, "I think it's fine." Logan snapped, irritation creeping into his tone. He stood up slightly, straightening his jacket. "Look, if you're trying to make a scene, this isn't the place." Naomi looked up from her phone. "You're right," she said softly. "It isn't." There was no tremor in her voice. No heat. That unsettled Logan more than anger would have. Richard adjusted his cufflinks again, sensing something he couldn't yet define. "Perhaps," he offered, "we should involve event staff." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "If you'd like," she replied. She pressed a single button on her screen and lifted the phone to her ear. The room leaned in without meaning to. "Daniel," she said, her tone steady. "Hold for confirmation." She lowered the phone again and looked directly at Richard Whitmore. "Before anyone relocates anyone else," she continued, "I'd suggest checking the agenda for tonight's closing remarks." Richard frowned faintly. "I'm aware of the agenda," he said. "Are you?" Naomi asked. Ethan's hands began to shake slightly. Around the ballroom, whispers formed small currents. Someone at a nearby table whispered, "Is that?" Another guest pulled up a digital program on their phone. Logan glanced between his father and Naomi, impatience turning to unease. "What exactly are you implying?" he demanded. Naomi's lips curved just slightly, not a smile, but something close to clarity. "Nothing," she replied. "Yet." The chandeliers glowed overhead, refracting light across crystal and silk and polished silver. Outside, Manhattan pulsed at 70 miles an hour. Inside, time slowed to the space between heartbeat and consequence. Naomi Carter stood in a wine-stained white dress at a table of billionaires who believed they had just corrected a social inconvenience. She had not raised her voice. She had not accused. She had not defended. She had simply remained. And in that stillness, something far more powerful than outrage began to unfold. 12 minutes. Naomi Carter repeated softly, and this time the number did not feel like a suggestion. It felt like a clock beginning to tick inside every mind at the table. The Crown Meridian Ballroom had regained its volume, but not its ease. Conversations resumed in fragments, but they curved back toward Table 7 like iron filings toward a magnet. Investors who had been discussing offshore wind capacity and tax incentives were now whispering about reputational risk and capital exposure. Naomi stood exactly where she had been when the wine touched her dress. The stain had darkened slightly, settling into the silk, but she did not attempt to hide it. She let it remain visible. Evidence without accusation. Richard Whitmore adjusted his posture, leaning forward with the deliberate calm of a man who had survived market crashes and regulatory investigations. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice measured now, stripped of earlier condescension. "If this evening has unfolded poorly, I would like to correct it." Immediately, Naomi regarded him with the same steady composure. "Evenings do not unfold," she replied quietly. "People do." Logan shifted beside his father, his earlier bravado dissolving into something defensive. "This is being exaggerated," he insisted. "It was a mistake." Naomi's gaze moved to him without hostility. "You looked at me before you tilted the glass," she said. The statement was factual, not emotional. Logan opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Because he remembered. He had looked at her. He had made a decision. Across the table, Ethan Brooks felt the weight of every second. He had built his early career studying patterns of leverage, of advantage, of timing. Tonight, he was watching all three converge in real time. He leaned toward Richard again. "Sir, The market will react before morning if this partnership shifts, he said in a low voice. Analysts are already expecting confirmation. Richard nodded once, slow and controlled. He knew the numbers. $650 million was not merely an infusion. It was a signal. It told competitors that Whitmore Industries was positioned for dominance in renewable infrastructure. It told shareholders that expansion was secure. It told the market that the Whitmore name still commanded confidence. Naomi Carter held the pen that would write that signal. And at this moment, she also held the option to erase it. Victoria Whitmore attempted a smile, though it trembled at the edges. Naomi, she began, carefully using the name now. We value our partnership deeply. You know how much this collaboration means. Naomi turned slightly toward her. I do, she said. That is why I came personally. There was no boasting in the statement. Only clarity. A waiter approached cautiously, uncertain whether to interrupt. Richard lifted a hand subtly, signaling him away. The air at the table felt denser, as if the oxygen had thinned. Nearby guests pretended not to stare while staring openly. The stage at the front of the ballroom glowed beneath soft lights. The large digital screen still displayed the logos of Whitmore Industries and Carter Global Holdings side by side, equal in size, equal in prominence. Naomi noticed it. So did everyone else. Logan ran a hand through his hair, forcing a laugh that did not land. You are not going to tank a deal over a social misunderstanding, he said. Naomi looked at him, and for the first time there was something sharper in her eyes. Not anger. Precision. You think this is about a social misunderstanding, she said. It is about assessment. Richard inhaled slowly. Assessment of what? He asked. Naomi folded her hands lightly in front of her. Assessment of alignment, she answered. The string quartet shifted into a more upbeat piece, unaware that the rhythm in the room had slowed to something deliberate and heavy. Naomi remembered another night years ago in Chicago. She had been negotiating a distribution contract valued at $80 million. The other party had asked if her company could truly handle nationwide scaling. She had responded with data, projections, performance history. The contract had closed successfully, but what she remembered most was not the negotiation. It was the doubt that preceded it. Doubt that had nothing to do with spreadsheets. Doubt that had everything to do with perception. Tonight felt familiar. Only the stakes were higher. Richard leaned back, recalculating. If you have concerns, he said, we address them professionally. That is how serious people operate. Naomi nodded slightly. Agreed. Her phone vibrated again. In her hand. Daniel. She glanced at the message. All media outlets present are preparing for confirmation statement. Awaiting your directive. She locked the screen without responding. Logan noticed. Who exactly are you texting? He demanded, impatience flaring again. Naomi looked at him. The people who ensure my decisions are implemented, she said. The answer landed harder than any raised voice could have. Around them, whispers thickened. A venture capitalist from San Francisco murmured to her colleague. If she withdraws, Whitmore stock dips by 10% before noon. A hedge fund director from Boston replied quietly, or more. Ethan felt the tremor of inevitability. Richard straightened again, this time not in dominance, but in negotiation. Naomi, he said, dropping formal distance, let us reset this moment. Public events are imperfect environments. Logan is young. Logan bristled. I am not a child, he snapped. Naomi did not take her eyes off Richard. Youth is not the issue, she said calmly. Judgment is. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. We have built this company over decades, she said. Our name stands for excellence. Naomi's gaze softened, but not in concession. Then you understand why I protect mine, she replied. The sentence settled like a stone dropped into still water. Silence radiated outward from it. 10 minutes now. The event coordinator near the stage glanced at her watch, unaware that the schedule was dissolving. Richard's mind ran scenarios at the speed of years of experience. Offer a public apology. Downplay the incident. Announce partnership anyway. Salvage optics. But he sensed something deeper was being measured. Naomi was not reacting to embarrassment. She was evaluating culture. What do you need to move forward? Richard asked finally. The question was not small. It was an admission that leverage had shifted. Naomi considered him for a long moment. I need confidence, she said. Confidence that when my name stands beside yours, it is respected in every room you enter. Logan exhaled sharply. You are making this personal. Naomi's response was immediate. It already was. The words were calm. They were not loud, but they cut through the remaining illusion that this could be brushed aside. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Around the ballroom, more guests had pulled out their phones, scrolling through profiles, confirming identities, recalculating alliances. Naomi Carter was not a guest who wandered into the wrong section. She was the capital partner whose decision would define the night. Richard leaned forward once more, voice low. If we issue a formal acknowledgement now, he said, publicly, before the confirmation, does that satisfy alignment? Naomi studied him. She could see calculation, urgency, damage control. What she did not yet see was understanding. Acknowledgement of what? She asked. Richard hesitated. That hesitation told her more than words could. 8 minutes. The stage lights glowed brighter as technicians prepared microphones. The event host shuffled index cards backstage, unaware that the script might not survive the next few minutes. Logan's shoulders had lost their earlier looseness. He looked at the stain on Naomi's dress as if it had become something dangerous. This is ridiculous, he muttered under his breath. Naomi heard him. She stepped closer to the table, close enough that her voice did not need to carry beyond it. Ridiculous, she repeated softly, is believing you can test someone's dignity and still expect their capital. Richard felt the shift fully now. This was not about embarrassment. It was about standards. Standards that had been referenced casually minutes earlier. Naomi glanced once more at the digital screen displaying both company logos. Equal. Balanced. For now. Her phone vibrated again. Daniel. 5 minutes until scheduled announcement. Awaiting final confirmation. Naomi did not respond. She looked directly at Richard Whitmore and said, You have 5 minutes left. The number did not echo. It settled. And in that settling, everyone at the table understood that the evening had crossed a threshold. Not because of spilled wine, but because of what it revealed. 5 minutes, Naomi Carter said, and this time the words did not feel like pressure. They felt like certainty. The Crown Meridian Ballroom continued to glow beneath crystal chandeliers, but the warmth in the room had cooled into calculation. At nearby tables, conversations had stopped pretending to be about energy markets and tax credits. They were about leverage now, about optics, about what would happen if the name Carter Global Holdings disappeared from that digital screen at the front of the room. Richard Whitmore held Naomi's gaze without blinking. Decades of negotiation had trained him to withstand silence. But this was not ordinary silence. This was silence with a deadline. Logan shifted again, his earlier confidence fully replaced by restless movement. He adjusted his cufflinks. He checked his phone. He avoided looking at the stain on Naomi's dress, as if ignoring it. Could reverse it. Victoria reached for her water glass instead of champagne this time. Her hands were steady, but her expression had lost its practiced ease. Naomi, she said, her tone carefully softened. What happened was inappropriate. I will say that clearly. The word hung in the air. Inappropriate. Not accidental. Not exaggerated. Inappropriate. Naomi nodded once. Clarity helps, she replied. Richard inhaled slowly. Logan, he said without looking at his son, speak. Logan's jaw tightened. Every instinct in him resisted public concession. He had never needed to offer one before. It was a mistake, he said finally. Naomi did not move. Say what you did, Richard added, his voice lower now. Logan exhaled through his nose. I poured wine on you, he said. The admission felt smaller than the act. Naomi tilted her head slightly. And, she prompted. Logan hesitated. Around them, investors leaned in subtly, as if pulled by gravity. Ethan Brooks felt the tension coiling tighter. And I should not have, Logan finished. Naomi studied him. Not for remorse. For awareness. Why? She asked. Logan blinked. Because it was disrespectful, he replied. Naomi's eyes held his for a moment longer. Yes, she said quietly. It was. For minutes. The event coordinator near the stage tapped the microphone gently, testing audio levels. The soft feedback rippled past unnoticed by most, but not by those at table 7. The schedule was moving forward. Tom did not pause for discomfort. Richard leaned forward again. We will issue a public apology before the confirmation, he said. Immediately. We will make it clear that the behavior displayed tonight does not reflect our values. Naomi listened. She had heard apologies before. Some were strategic. Some were sincere. The difference was not in the wording. It was in what followed. Values, she repeated softly. What are they, Richard? The question was not rhetorical. It was direct. Richard straightened. Accountability. Excellence. Integrity, he said without hesitation. Words that had decorated annual reports for years. Naomi nodded slowly. Then tonight is a test of them, she replied. Across the ballroom, more phones were raised. Not for spectacle now. For documentation. The narrative was shifting in real time. Logan looked at his father, then back at Naomi. You are not going to dismantle a $650 million partnership over this, he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it once held. Naomi did not flinch. I am evaluating whether to proceed with one, she answered. The distinction was precise. Investors exchanged glances. A renewable energy executive from Denver whispered, if she withdraws, secondary investors follow. A venture partner from Chicago nodded subtly. Capital did not like instability. It avoided environments where leadership felt misaligned. Victoria leaned forward now, urgency breaking through her restraint. What do you require? She asked. Naomi considered the question carefully, not because she needed time, but because she wanted them to understand that this was not about optics. I require proof, she said. Proof that respect is not situational. Silence settled again. Logan's shoulders dropped slightly. For the first time that evening, uncertainty replaced pride in his expression. What does that look like? He asked. Naomi glanced briefly toward the stage. The dual logos glowed under white light. Carter Global Holdings beside Whitmore Industries. Equal. Balanced. For now. It looks like acknowledgement without defensiveness, she said. It looks like accountability without qualification. And it looks like change that extends beyond this table. Richard absorbed the words. This was no longer about saving face. It was about demonstrating leadership under scrutiny. 3 minutes. The host at the front of the room shuffled the event cards again, glancing toward the Whitmore table for confirmation. The musicians slowed their tempo slightly, as if sensing the shift in atmosphere. Naomi's phone vibrated once more. Daniel, media outlets are monitoring for confirmation statement. Please advise. Naomi locked the screen without responding. The decision was not yet complete. Richard stood up slowly. The movement drew attention instantly. Conversations quieted across the ballroom. He did not raise his voice, but his presence carried. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his tone firm but measured. Before we proceed with our scheduled announcement, there is something I need to address. Every eye in the room turned toward him. Naomi remained standing at his side, still, composed, the wine stain visible beneath the chandeliers. Richard continued. Earlier this evening, an unacceptable act of disrespect occurred at this table. It was directed toward Ms. Naomi Carter, our capital partner and the leader of Carter Global Holdings. A ripple moved through the crowd. Some guests nodded. Others glanced at Naomi with new understanding. Richard's jaw tightened slightly as he continued. That behavior does not represent our values. It does not represent my leadership, and it will not be dismissed. Logan stood beside him. Now, visibly uncomfortable but present. I made a mistake, Logan said, his voice audible but restrained. It was disrespectful and unprofessional. The words were simple. They were not theatrical, but they were spoken publicly. Naomi listened without expression. Victoria stepped forward slightly as well. We are committed to accountability, she added. In this room and beyond it. The ballroom held its breath. Naomi could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes. She had not sought spectacle. She had sought clarity. She turned slowly to face the crowd, her voice steady and unhurried. Thank you, she said. Nothing more. No grand statement. No raised tone. Just acknowledgement. 2 minutes. Richard looked at her carefully. Is this sufficient? He asked quietly, so only those closest could hear. Naomi considered him for a long moment. She measured posture, tone, ownership. She measured whether the apology had been given to protect a deal or to uphold a principle. She could not read the future, but she could read the present. It is a start, she said. Logan exhaled slowly, relief mixing with lingering unease. But Naomi's eyes did not soften. Understand this, she added calmly. Capital follows culture. If the culture fails, the capital leaves. The statement was not a threat. It was economics. Ethan felt the truth of it settle into his chest. Markets rewarded alignment. They punished arrogance. 1 minute. The host stepped toward the microphone again, glancing at Richard for confirmation. Richard looked at Naomi. The decision now rested visibly with her. Naomi lifted her phone. She typed 2 words to Daniel. Proceed conditionally. She slipped the phone back into her clutch. Then she turned toward the stage lights. The ballroom straightened collectively, anticipation rebuilding. The digital screen brightened, the logos sharpening against a white backdrop. Naomi Carter stood in a wine-stained white dress beneath crystal chandeliers in Midtown Manhattan, not diminished, not reactive, but deliberate. And as the final seconds ticked down toward the announcement that could reshape an industry, everyone in that room understood something they had not understood 15 minutes earlier. Power does not shout. It evaluates. And when it decides, the room adjusts. Proceed, Naomi Carter said softly, and the word traveled farther than the microphone ever could. The host at the front of the ballroom received a subtle nod from Richard Whitmore and stepped fully into the light. The string quartet faded into silence, bows resting against strings. The Crown Meridian Ballroom straightened as one body. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above tables set with polished silver and folded linen, and the massive digital screen behind the stage glowed brighter. The logos of Whitmore Industries and Carter Global Holdings suspended side by side, like a promise waiting to be sealed. Naomi remained near table 7 for one final breath, then began walking toward the stage. The red wine stain on her white silk dress was no longer an embarrassment. It was a marker, a reminder. Each step was unhurried. 3-inch heels against marble carried with calm precision. Conversations dissolved entirely now. Every eye followed her. Logan Whitmore felt the weight of those eyes shift from curiosity to judgment. He had spent his life believing rooms would orbit him. Tonight, the orbit had changed. Victoria folded her hands tightly in front of her. Richard watched Naomi cross the floor with an expression that blended relief and respect. He understood that what was about to happen would determine more than a quarterly forecast. It would define the narrative of his leadership. Naomi reached the base of the stage and paused briefly. The host extended a hand to assist her up the single step, but she did not require help. She ascended on her own, steady and composed, turning to face a room filled with investors, executives, journalists, and analysts. The microphone stood waiting. She did not touch it immediately. Instead, she looked out across the ballroom, her gaze sweeping from left to right, taking in faces that minutes ago had witnessed something small and revealing. She allowed the silence to expand just long enough for discomfort to settle fully into awareness. Then she spoke. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and measured, carrying effortlessly across the room. Tonight was meant to be about partnership. The sentence landed gently, but its implication was heavy. She did not reference the incident directly. She did not dramatize it. She did not accuse. She simply acknowledged context. Partnership, she continued, is not only about capital. It is about alignment. It is about the values that accompany that capital into every room. Investors leaned forward slightly in their chairs. Pens hovered above notebooks. Phones remained raised discreetly. Naomi's tone did not rise. It did not sharpen. It remained even, deliberate, steady. Carter Global Holdings has invested in infrastructure across this country for over a decade, she said. We have committed resources not just to projects, but to principles. Efficiency, sustainability, accountability. She allowed a brief pause before adding, and respect. The words settled with intention. Richard stood at the edge of the stage, listening closely. Logan remained near the table, shoulders tight, the echo of his earlier actions reverberating louder now in silence than they ever had in laughter. Naomi continued, "When we align with a company, we align our name with theirs. That alignment must extend beyond contracts and projections. It must reflect how leadership behaves when no one expects scrutiny." A ripple moved through the ballroom. Subtle nods. Quiet acknowledgement. Naomi did not look at the Whitmores as she spoke. She did not need to. The entire room understood the subtext. "Tonight," she said calmly, "we were given clarity." The sentence held no anger, only fact. She let it linger, then shifted her focus toward the future. "Clarity can either fracture partnership," she continued, "or strengthen it." Richard inhaled slowly. He recognized the pivot. Naomi was not dismantling the deal. She was defining its terms in public. "Carter Global Holdings will proceed with this partnership," she said, and a collective exhale moved through the room like wind across glass. But she did not finish there. Conditionally, she added. The relief stalled mid-breath. Naomi's gaze sharpened slightly, not with hostility, but with precision. We will proceed with a formal cultural audit of Whitmore Industries over the next 90 days. We will review leadership protocols, accountability measures, and training frameworks to ensure alignment with the standards our capital represents. The ballroom absorbed the statement in layered waves. Investors exchanged looks. Journalists typed faster. The word audit carried weight. It signaled oversight. It signaled expectation. Richard's jaw tightened briefly, then relaxed. He understood leverage when he heard it. Naomi continued without raising her voice. Partnership means shared responsibility. Shared responsibility requires transparency. Transparency builds trust. She placed her hands lightly on either side of the podium. This investment is not simply a financial endorsement. It is a statement of confidence. And confidence must be earned continuously. There was no hostility in her tone, only resolve. Logan felt the room's perception shift permanently. His action had not destroyed the deal, but it had altered its structure. Naomi concluded with a final measured sentence. When we walk into a room, we bring more than numbers. We bring identity. We bring history. We bring expectation. Let us ensure that every room we enter reflects the respect we claim to uphold. Silence followed. Then, slowly, applause began. Not explosive, not performative, steady, intentional. Investors stood gradually, recognizing leadership when they saw it. The applause grew stronger, echoing beneath crystal and glass. Richard joined it. Victoria followed. Even Logan clapped, though his hands felt heavier than before. Naomi stepped back from the microphone, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. The digital screen behind her transitioned smoothly to display confirmation of the $650 million capital commitment, accompanied by the word strategic partnership for sustainable growth. The deal had survived, but it had been reshaped. Naomi descended from the stage with the same measured calm she had ascended with. The red stain on her dress remained visible under the lights. It no longer symbolized disrespect. It symbolized evaluation. As she returned toward table 7, investors approached her carefully, offering congratulations not only for the deal, but for the clarity with which she had handled the evening. Ethan Brooks felt something shift permanently in his understanding of power. It was not loud. It was not reactive. It was deliberate and disciplined. Richard met Naomi halfway across the floor. "You handled that with grace," he said quietly. Naomi looked at him steadily. "Grace is easy," she replied. "Standards are harder." Richard nodded once, absorbing the truth of it. Logan approached more cautiously this time. "I will do better," he said, not to salvage pride, but because the room demanded growth. Naomi regarded him for a long moment. "See that you do," she answered calmly. The ballroom resumed its rhythm slowly. Music returned. Conversations reformed. But something intangible had changed. Respect no longer floated casually through the room. It had weight now. Naomi Carter adjusted her clutch at her side, the phone inside silent for the moment. She had not raised her voice. She had not withdrawn her capital. She had not humiliated anyone in return. She had evaluated, restructured, and defined the terms of engagement in real time. And as the Crown Meridian Ballroom settled into its post-announcement glow, one truth remained undeniable to every person present. The most powerful shift in the room had not been the confirmation of a $650 million deal. It had been the quiet recalibration of who truly set the standard. Reputation travels faster than press releases, Naomi Carter said quietly as the applause faded into the steady hum of post-announcement conversation. The Crown Meridian Ballroom had shifted once again, but this time the shift was deliberate. Investors approached in controlled waves, offering congratulations that were layered with new respect. The $650 million commitment glowed across the digital screen, confirmed and documented, yet the true headline of the evening had already written itself into every conversation. Naomi stood near the edge of the dance floor, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass behind her, lights reflecting off the Hudson River like scattered coins. The red stain remained visible against her white silk dress. She had not requested a replacement. She had not stepped away to conceal it. It remained present, like a watermark beneath the chandeliers. Richard Whitmore approached her again, this time without urgency. "I appreciate your decision," he said evenly. His tone had changed from negotiation to recognition. Naomi regarded him with calm clarity. "You did not need my appreciation," she replied. "You needed accountability." Richard nodded once. He understood that the 90-day cultural audit was not symbolic. It would require transparency. It would require vulnerability. It would require change. Logan hovered several steps behind his father, quieter now, observing conversations he was no longer controlling. A group of young analysts from a New York investment firm watched Naomi with a different lens than they had 20 minutes earlier. One of them whispered, "She could have ended it." Another replied softly, "She restructured it." Ethan Brooks approached cautiously, a mix of admiration and humility in his posture. "Ms. Carter," he said, voice steady but sincere. "That was leadership." Naomi met his gaze. "Leadership," she answered, "is not about volume. It is about direction." Ethan absorbed the sentence carefully, committing it to memory. Around them, media representatives began drafting summaries for morning editions. The narrative would not focus on spilled wine. It would focus on standards, on the cultural audit, on conditional partnership. Naomi's phone vibrated once. "Daniel." She stepped slightly away from the cluster of executives and answered quietly. "It is confirmed," Daniel said on the other end. "Market analysts are already commenting on the structural shift. The audit requirement is trending as a precedent." Naomi glanced across the ballroom, where conversations had softened into strategic recalculations. "Good," she replied. "Precedent is useful." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her clutch. Victoria Whitmore approached next, her expression no longer guarded but reflective. "I owe you a personal apology as well," she said quietly. Naomi studied her for a moment. "Apologies matter," she responded. "What follows them matters more." Victoria nodded slowly. The music resumed with a smoother rhythm, a pianist replacing the quartet with a quieter melody that felt less ceremonial and more contemplative. Guests returned to their seats, though no one forgot what had unfolded. Logan finally stepped forward. His voice was no longer defensive. "I underestimated the weight of my behavior," he admitted. Naomi did not soften. She did not harden either. She simply listened. "Weight is not always visible," she said, "but it is always felt." Logan swallowed, absorbing the lesson more deeply than he would have expected. The ballroom lights reflected across polished marble floors as waitstaff resumed service, refilling glasses and clearing plates. The atmosphere was no longer tense, but it was not casual either. It carried the awareness of recalibration. Richard glanced at the stage, where the confirmed partnership details continued to scroll across the screen. "You redefined the structure in front of everyone," he said to Naomi. "You could have handled it privately." Naomi's gaze moved to the skyline beyond the glass. "Private correction rarely changes public behavior," she answered. "Transparency creates accountability." Richard understood the implication fully. The audit was not punishment. It was alignment. Across the room, a veteran energy consultant from Houston leaned toward a colleague. "This will shift corporate governance expectations," he murmured. The colleague nodded. "Other firms will follow." Naomi felt none of the triumph that might have accompanied such recognition. Instead, she felt steadiness. Years ago, at age 24, she had been escorted politely from a corporate networking reception because someone assumed she was catering staff. She remembered the polite smiles, the subtle redirection, the dismissal disguised as courtesy. That night had been quieter than this one. There had been no stage, no digital screen, no applause. But the lesson had embedded itself permanently. Respect that depends on assumption is not respect at all. Tonight, that lesson had surfaced again. Only this time she had not been redirected. She had redirected the room. Ethan rejoined the Whitmore table, his mind racing with projections and policy shifts. The audit could strengthen investor confidence long-term, he suggested to Richard. If handled correctly. Richard nodded slowly. "It will be handled correctly," he replied. Logan listened, absorbing the fact that growth would now require more than inherited status. Naomi glanced once more at the stain on her dress. Under the ballroom lights, it appeared almost abstract, a splash of red against white that told a story without needing explanation. A journalist approached cautiously, recorder in hand. "Ms. Carter," she began, "how would you describe tonight's outcome?" Naomi offered a small, controlled smile. "Constructive," she said simply. The journalist blinked, expecting more. But there was no need for elaboration. Constructive implied tension resolved through structure. It implied challenge transformed into progress. It implied leadership exercised without spectacle. As the evening progressed, conversations shifted from gossip to strategy. Investors discussed implementation timelines. Analysts debated governance metrics. The 90-day review had become the focal point of the partnership, a symbol that capital and culture were inseparable. Richard watched Naomi from across the room with a mixture of admiration and recalibrated respect. He had built his empire through acquisitions and expansion. Tonight, he had witnessed a different kind of leverage. The kind that did not require raised voices or dramatic exits. The kind that required discipline. Logan approached Naomi one final time before the night ended. I understand if you never forget what happened, he said. Naomi's expression remained composed. Forgetting is not the objective, she replied. Learning is. Logan nodded slowly. It was the first time he appeared smaller not in status, but in ego. Naomi glanced toward the stage once more. The logos remained illuminated. Carter Global Holdings and Whitmore Industries. Equal. Balanced. Conditional. The partnership had survived, but it would not proceed unchanged. As guests began collecting coats and preparing to descend 38 floors back into the rhythm of Manhattan streets, the narrative of the evening had crystallized. It was not about humiliation. It was about evaluation. It was not about retaliation. It was about restructuring expectation. Naomi Carter walked toward the exit with measured calm, the skyline reflecting in the glass beside her. The red stain on her dress remained visible as she stepped into the elevator, but it no longer represented disrespect. It represented proof. Proof that dignity does not need to shout. Proof that leadership does not need to retaliate. Proof that when power is rooted in principle, it reshapes the room without ever raising its voice. Respect does not end when the music fades, Naomi Carter said quietly as the elevator doors closed behind her. The descent from the 38th floor of the Crown Meridian felt slower than the night had moved. Reflections of Manhattan's skyline slid across the mirrored walls, city lights stretching and bending like distant constellations. The red stain on her white silk dress remained visible under the soft elevator lighting, no longer dramatic, no longer shocking. It had become symbolic. When the doors opened into the marble lobby below, the world had already begun reacting. Financial news alerts flashed across digital tickers mounted behind the concierge desk. Guests exiting the gala glanced at their phones, reading early summaries of the conditional partnership. The story was spreading faster than the event had unfolded. Naomi stepped onto the polished floor with the same measured composure she had carried all evening. Outside, black sedans lined the curb beneath bright canopy lights. Traffic along West 57th Street moved steadily, taxis weaving between lanes at 25 miles per hour, horns echoing faintly against glass and steel. Daniel's voice came through her phone the moment she stepped outside. Markets are responding positively to the governance clause, he said. Analysts are calling it a model for responsible capital alignment. Naomi watched the reflection of city lights ripple across a rain-slick stretch of pavement. It was necessary, she replied. Momentum without structure creates risk. A cool breeze brushed against her shoulders as she waited for her car. Guests filtered out behind her in clusters. Conversations hushed, but energized. She could hear fragments as they passed. She handled that flawlessly. That audit requirement will change the industry. Whitmore will have to adapt. The night air felt different than the ballroom. Less curated. More honest. Daniel continued on the line. There is something else, he said carefully. Naomi listened. Several corporate boards are already requesting consultations about implementing similar cultural oversight frameworks. They want Carter Global involved. Naomi allowed herself a brief pause. Not from hesitation, but from perspective. What had begun as a moment of disrespect had evolved into structural precedent. Schedule exploratory calls, she said calmly, but emphasize that culture cannot be outsourced. It must be owned. Daniel acknowledged the instruction and ended the call. A black sedan pulled to the curb. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Naomi entered without rushing, the leather interior cool against her skin. As the car merged into traffic, the city stretched forward in ribbons of red tail lights and white headlights. She leaned back slightly, exhaling not in relief but in reflection. Her mind replayed the sequence of events. The tilt of a glass. The laughter. The silence that followed. The recalibration that reshaped the room. Years earlier, she had experienced moments where silence meant powerlessness. Tonight, silence had meant evaluation. The car moved south along 10th Avenue, passing illuminated storefronts and late-night diners still open beneath fluorescent lights. Naomi's phone buzzed again. A message from a former mentor in Atlanta. I saw the coverage. You did not react. You redirected. She allowed herself a faint smile. Redirection required discipline. It required restraint in the face of impulse. It required remembering that retaliation is loud, but reform is lasting. The sedan stopped at a red light near Columbus Circle. Neon signs flickered above the intersection. Pedestrians crossed in steady streams, bundled against the night chill. Naomi glanced down at her dress once more. The red stain had darkened further, settling into fabric. She could have changed before leaving the ballroom. Staff had offered. She had declined. The mark had meaning. It was a reminder that dignity is tested in small moments before it is demonstrated in large ones. The light turned green. Traffic resumed. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Ethan Brooks. His message was brief. Thank you for showing what accountability looks like. Naomi considered the words carefully before responding. Accountability is not shown. It is practiced. She pressed send and placed the phone back into her clutch. The skyline shifted as the car moved further downtown, skyscrapers narrowing into older brick facades and quiet residential streets. The intensity of the gala felt distant now, but its impact had already begun rippling outward. Richard Whitmore, back in the ballroom, was undoubtedly reviewing immediate action steps. Logan was likely confronting the weight of his own misjudgment in ways he had never been required to before. Victoria was perhaps recalibrating how legacy and leadership intersected. The 90-day audit was no longer a clause. It was a catalyst. Naomi's thoughts drifted further back, to a boardroom in Houston when she was 32. She had been presenting a proposal to acquire a struggling energy distribution network. A senior executive had questioned her authority in front of the entire board. Not her numbers. Not her data. Her authority. She remembered the heat in her chest that day, the instinct to push back with equal intensity. Instead, she had finished her presentation calmly. The acquisition had passed unanimously. Years later, that same executive had admitted he had underestimated her. Tonight felt similar, only the scale was larger and the audience broader. The car slowed as it approached her residential building, a modern tower overlooking the river. The driver pulled to the curb and stepped out again, opening the door. Naomi exited gracefully, heels clicking softly against the sidewalk. The lobby attendant greeted her with a respectful nod. Good evening, Miss Carter. Good evening, she replied, her tone steady as ever. Inside the lobby, polished stone floors reflected warm lighting. It was quieter here. No applause. No murmured speculation. Just the steady hum of climate control and the distant sound of an elevator ascending. As she crossed the lobby, she caught her reflection in a mirrored column. The red stain remained vivid against white silk. She studied it not with frustration, but with recognition. Moments like this did not define her. They revealed others. The elevator carried her upward, floors passing one by one in soft, illuminated numbers. When the doors opened into her private foyer, the silence felt intentional. She stepped inside, removing her heels and setting them neatly by the door. The city lights streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows in her living room, reflecting across dark hardwood floors. She walked toward the window slowly, gazing out at the river below. The Hudson moved steadily in the night, unaffected by the headlines already forming about governance reform and capital accountability. Power, she had learned, was like water. It did not need to crash loudly to reshape its surroundings. It moved persistently, quietly, over time. Her phone buzzed one final time that evening. A short message from Daniel. Whitmore Board has requested immediate preliminary meeting. They want to begin audit planning tomorrow morning. Naomi allowed a small nod to herself. Action had already begun. She typed a brief response. 8 a.m. Eastern. Be prepared. She set the phone down on a nearby table and walked toward her bedroom. The evening's events were already transitioning from moment to movement, from incident to institutional shift. As she unzipped the stained dress and laid it carefully across a chair, She did not view it as damaged. She viewed it as documented. Documented proof that composure is not passive. That silence can be strategic. That capital, when guided by principle, does more than invest. It influences. The city beyond her window continued to pulse beneath the night sky. And somewhere across Manhattan, in offices and boardrooms and quiet apartments, the story of the evening was being retold. Not as a scandal, not a spectacle, but as an example. An example that leadership does not shout to be heard. It stands. It evaluates. And when necessary, it restructures the room without ever losing its balance. Pressure reveals architecture. Naomi Carter said quietly the next morning as sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors of her apartment. Manhattan did not pause for reflection. By 8 a.m. Eastern, financial networks were already dissecting the previous evening's announcement. Screens in trading rooms from New York to San Francisco displayed headlines highlighting governance reform, capital alignment, and the newly announced 90-day cultural audit. Naomi stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River, dressed now in a tailored charcoal suit, her composure unchanged from the night before. The red-stained white dress hung in her private closet, not discarded, not hidden, preserved. Daniel's face appeared on the large monitor in her home office precisely at 8 o'clock. Whitmore board members are joining the call, he said. They are early. Naomi nodded once. Prepared? She asked. Fully, Daniel replied. The screen shifted as multiple video feeds connected. Richard Whitmore appeared first, seated at the head of a long, polished conference table inside Whitmore Industries headquarters. Victoria sat beside him. Logan appeared further down the table, posture restrained, expression measured. Other board members filled the remaining squares on the screen, faces attentive and serious. The atmosphere was different from the ballroom. There were no chandeliers, no string quartet, no applause, only responsibility. Good morning, Ms. Carter, Richard began formally. We appreciate your willingness to convene immediately. Naomi met his gaze through the screen. Alignment begins with urgency, she replied evenly. Let us begin. The boardroom camera adjusted slightly, revealing stacks of documents, tablets, and printed summaries of the previous evening's media coverage. Naomi did not comment on the headlines. She focused on structure. The audit will operate in 3 phases, she said calmly. Leadership evaluation, internal policy review, and culture assessment across all management tiers. A board member from Chicago leaned forward. Will this be external oversight? He asked. It will be collaborative, Naomi answered. But independent. Richard nodded slowly. He understood that independence was essential to credibility. Logan remained silent, absorbing the weight of institutional reform tied to his personal misjudgment. Naomi continued without raising her tone. Transparency will require access, she said. Internal communications, hiring protocols, complaint resolution frameworks, and executive conduct guidelines. A murmur moved across the boardroom table. These were not surface adjustments. These were foundational reviews. Victoria spoke carefully. We are prepared to grant access, she said, if it strengthens the partnership. Naomi inclined her head slightly. Strength is not the objective, she replied. Integrity is. The word carried through the speakers clearly. In a separate Midtown office, Carter Global Holdings executives observed the call in silence, prepared to implement whatever framework Naomi authorized. Daniel watched her closely. She did not rush. She did not press. She laid out expectation with precision. The first report will be delivered within 30 days, she said. Preliminary findings will be shared transparently with investors. One board member hesitated. Publicly, he asked. Naomi met his gaze calmly through the camera. Accountability is not selective, she said. Silence followed. Richard broke it with steady resolve. Agreed, he said. The words settled the room. Logan finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had been the night before. I will participate fully, he said. Naomi looked at him evenly. Participation is assumed, she replied. Growth is demonstrated. The distinction lingered. Outside her window, morning traffic flowed along the West Side Highway, steady and relentless. Markets had opened with modest gains for Whitmore Industries, analysts noting investor confidence in structural reform. What could have become a crisis had become a case study. But Naomi understood something deeper. Reform announced is not reform completed. She turned slightly in her chair, maintaining eye contact with the screen. "This is not a punitive measure," she said. "It is preventative." A board member from Houston nodded slowly. "Understood," he said. Richard exhaled once, tension replaced by determination. "We will schedule internal briefings immediately," he said. "There will be no resistance." Naomi heard the sincerity beneath the words. "Good," she answered. "Resistance signals misalignment." The meeting continued for over an hour, outlining timelines, personnel access, and compliance expectations. No voices rose. No defensiveness returned. The gravity of the previous evening had transformed into disciplined forward motion. When the call concluded, Richard remained on the screen momentarily. "You could have withdrawn," he said quietly, once the others had disconnected. Naomi regarded him steadily. "Withdrawal does not always produce correction," she replied. "Sometimes structure does." Richard nodded slowly, absorbing the truth of it. The screen went dark. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "You just set a precedent," he said. Naomi stood and walked toward the window again. The river reflected morning light and steady ripples. "Precedent is not power," she replied. "Consistency is." Her phone vibrated with a message from Ethan Brooks. "The audit framework is being discussed across 3 firms already." Naomi allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The ripple was spreading. Not from outrage. From discipline. She placed the phone down and looked out across the city once more. Somewhere in another office across town, Logan Whitmore sat in silence, likely confronting more than policy adjustments. He was confronting perception, identity, responsibility. The weight of his family name had shifted slightly on his shoulders. Victoria was likely reviewing internal training protocols that had gone unquestioned for years. Richard was likely recalculating governance strategy beyond quarterly performance metrics. The previous evening had not ended with applause. It had begun with evaluation. Naomi returned to her desk and opened a folder labeled Cultural Infrastructure. Inside were case studies from prior investments where governance reform had preceded financial growth. She reviewed them carefully, knowing that leadership required follow-through beyond symbolism. Her assistant entered quietly with coffee. "The board from Denver wants to speak this afternoon," she said. Naomi nodded. "Schedule it," she replied. Same framework. The day unfolded steadily, meeting by meeting, call by call. Analysts requested commentary. Journalists sought interviews. Naomi declined most. Her focus remained on implementation, not headlines. By late afternoon, a draft of Whitmore Industries' internal audit roadmap had already been circulated for approval. Speed signaled seriousness. As evening approached once more, Manhattan's skyline shifted from daylight clarity to amber dusk. Naomi stood again by the window, reflecting not on triumph, but on trajectory. The red-stained dress remained preserved in her closet, no longer a symbol of insult, but of inflection. A moment where reaction could have shattered alignment, but restraint had restructured it. Her phone buzzed one final time that evening. A short message from Richard. Initial internal memo issued. Accountability language adopted without modification. Naomi read it once, then placed the phone down. The city lights flickered on below her, steady and indifferent. Leadership was not loud. It did not demand recognition. It required endurance. The partnership had survived the night. But more importantly, it had begun to evolve the morning after. And as Manhattan settled into another restless evening, one truth remained clear beneath the skyline. When principle guides power, even a moment of disrespect can become the foundation for systemic change. Transformation is not declared, it is measured, Naomi Carter said softly 3 days later as she stood inside the glass-walled executive conference room at Carter Global Holdings. Morning light spilled across the long walnut table where her senior leadership team sat reviewing preliminary audit access documents from Whitmore Industries. Outside, Manhattan pulsed in its usual rhythm, yellow taxis moving at steady intervals along the avenues, pedestrians crossing intersections with purpose. Inside, the atmosphere was focused, disciplined, forward-looking. Daniel projected the first wave of internal data onto the screen. Leadership communication logs, hiring statistics, employee satisfaction reports segmented by department. The numbers told stories without emotion. They revealed patterns. Naomi studied them without commentary for several long seconds. Culture leaves fingerprints, she said finally. Even when people believe it is invisible. The room remained quiet. Her team understood that this audit was not symbolic. It would either validate alignment or expose fracture points. Initial indicators show centralized decision authority concentrated in a narrow executive band, Daniel said. Complaint resolution timelines exceed industry benchmarks by 30%. Naomi folded her hands calmly. Then we begin there, she replied. Accountability accelerates where transparency increases. Across town, in Whitmore Industries headquarters, Richard Whitmore convened his own leadership session. He stood at the head of a polished oak table, the city skyline behind him, echoing Naomi's vantage point from her own office. We are not performing compliance, he told his executives. We are implementing correction. The tone was firm, not defensive. Logan sat among the leadership group, silent but attentive. The previous weekend had altered more than his public image. It had shifted his internal calibration. He watched the data summaries appear on their own screen, each statistic reinforcing the necessity of change. Participation will be mandatory, Richard continued. From entry-level associates to senior vice presidents. Victoria reviewed draft policy updates beside him, marking sections that required clearer language around executive conduct expectations. The audit was no longer a headline. It was operational. Back at Carter Global Holdings, Naomi's phone buzzed with a message. From a journalist requesting commentary on the broader industry implications of governance reform. She silenced the notification without responding. Narrative mattered less than execution. Schedule in-person interviews with department heads beginning tomorrow, she instructed Daniel. Hybrid model. Virtual for regional offices, on-site for Manhattan headquarters. Her voice carried calm certainty. Her team began coordinating schedules immediately. Outside, clouds gathered over the Hudson, soft gray shapes forming against the blue. Change, she often believed, moved like weather. Gradual, then undeniable. That afternoon, Naomi traveled to Whitmore Industries for the first in-person review session. The lobby felt different from the gala ballroom. No chandeliers, no orchestra, just polished marble floors, security desks, and the quiet hum of corporate routine. Employees recognized her as she entered, some nodding respectfully, others glancing curiously. Logan met her near the elevator bank. Thank you for coming directly, he said. His tone was restrained, stripped of previous bravado. Naomi regarded him evenly. Accountability does not operate remotely, she replied. They ascended together to the executive floor. The conference room awaited with prepared documents neatly arranged at each seat. Department leaders entered one by one, expressions serious but cooperative. Naomi did not dominate the table. She facilitated. She asked measured questions about decision-making channels, about reporting structures, about behavioral training protocols. How are concerns escalated? She asked a human resources director. Anonymously through internal systems, the director replied. Response time. Naomi pressed gently. Approximately 10 business days. Naomi's gaze remained steady. Industry benchmark is 5, she noted. Silence followed. Not accusatory. Informational. The difference mattered. As the session progressed, patterns surfaced. Communication bottlenecks. Hierarchical insulation. Informal assumptions that had calcified into practice. Logan listened carefully as managers acknowledged blind spots. He spoke only once. What immediate changes can we implement before the 90-day report? He asked. Naomi glanced at him briefly. Clarity in language, she answered. And consistency in response. Her tone did not soften. It did not sharpen. It remained instructional. Hours passed. The room grew quieter, not from tension but from concentration. By early evening, the first action plan draft had taken shape. Mandatory leadership workshops. Revised escalation timelines. Clearer executive accountability clauses tied to performance evaluations. As Naomi prepared to leave, Richard approached her privately. This will not be easy, he said. Naomi met his gaze. Sustainable growth rarely is, she replied. Outside, dusk had settled over Manhattan once again. Streetlights illuminated sidewalks where commuters moved briskly toward subway entrances and parking garages. Naomi stepped into her waiting car, the city reflecting across its windows. Her phone buzzed with an internal update from Daniel. Other firms are requesting audit frameworks modeled after this one. She allowed herself a brief nod. The ripple continued outward. Back in Whitmore headquarters, Logan remained in the conference room after others had left. He studied the revised conduct document in front of him. Words like respect, equity, and responsibility were no longer abstract. They were embedded in measurable timelines and policy language. He remembered the tilt of the glass, the laughter, the silence that followed. And he understood now that moments define culture when culture fails to define moments. Richard entered quietly and stood beside him. Leadership is tested when it is challenged, he said. Logan looked up. I did not expect to be challenged that way, he admitted. Richard's expression softened slightly. That is precisely why it mattered. Meanwhile, Naomi returned to her apartment, the skyline glowing beyond her windows. She placed her bag on the console table and walked toward the glass. The Hudson moved steadily beneath the fading light. She thought briefly of her father, who once told her that dignity is not given. It is carried. Tonight, dignity had moved through boardrooms and policy drafts and executive admissions. It had shifted conversation from optics to operations. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Victoria. Thank you for insisting on structure. Naomi typed a brief reply. Structure protects everyone. She set the phone aside and exhaled slowly. The red-stained dress still hung in her closet, a quiet reminder of inflection. But now it represented something more expansive than a single evening. It represented proof that discipline under pressure creates systemic change. As Manhattan settled into night once more, offices dimming one by one across the skyline, the transformation underway was no longer symbolic. It was measurable. Policy drafts revised. Timelines accelerated. Leadership recalibrated. And in the quiet of her apartment, Naomi Carter understood something she had always known. True power is not in the reaction. It is in the restructuring that follows. Sustained change is quieter than headlines. Naomi Carter said softly 2 weeks into the 90-day review as she sat at the head of the long glass conference table inside Whitmore Industries headquarters. The skyline beyond the windows shimmered beneath a pale autumn sun, traffic below, moving steadily along Madison Avenue at mid-morning pace. What had begun as a single public moment had now evolved into structured transformation. Printed audit summaries lay neatly arranged before each executive. Charts tracked response times to internal complaints. New escalation protocols were highlighted in blue ink. Measurable benchmarks had replaced vague assurances. Naomi did not rush through the documents. She turned each page deliberately, studying patterns with the same composure she had shown the night of the gala. Richard Whitmore watched her carefully from across the table, aware that progress would be evaluated not by speed, but by sincerity. Preliminary leadership workshops have been completed across 4 divisions, a senior operations officer reported. Attendance was 100%. Naomi nodded once. Participation is a beginning, she replied. Application is the goal. Logan sat several seats down, reviewing revised executive conduct clauses that now linked compensation incentives directly to leadership accountability metrics. He understood the symbolism. Behavior was no longer separate from performance. It was embedded in it. The air inside the conference room felt purposeful rather than tense. The review was no longer reactive. It was operational. Internal survey data shows a 20% increase in employee confidence regarding complaint resolution transparency, the human resources director added. Naomi's gaze remained steady. What about follow-through? She asked. Metrics without momentum create illusion. Silence followed briefly as the director flipped through her folder. Follow-up interviews indicate improved trust in management accessibility, she answered. Naomi inclined her head slightly. Progress acknowledged, not celebrated. Outside, sunlight reflected off nearby skyscraper glass, casting shifting patterns across the table. Daniel, joining remotely from Carter Global Holdings, displayed comparative industry data on the screen. Whitmore Industries now exceeds median governance response benchmarks in 2 of 3 categories, he explained. The 3rd category remains slightly below average. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. Which category? She asked. Executive accountability transparency, Daniel replied. Richard exhaled slowly. That will change, he said firmly. Naomi looked at him evenly. Then let it change visibly, she responded. The distinction mattered. Quiet improvement built confidence. Visible accountability built credibility. As the meeting progressed, department heads described policy revisions implemented within the first 14 days. Anonymous reporting channels streamlined. Executive review boards expanded to include independent observers. Mandatory ethics briefings scheduled quarterly rather than annually. Logan listened carefully, absorbing not just policy language, but the weight of cultural recalibration. When the session paused, for a short break, he approached Naomi near the window overlooking the city. "I underestimated the ripple effect of a single moment," he said quietly. Naomi did not turn immediately. She watched traffic flow beneath them, steady and indifferent. "Moments reveal frameworks," she replied. "Frameworks determine outcomes." Logan nodded, absorbing the lesson more fully now than he had during the gala. "I have begun meeting with junior staff directly," he added, "without scheduling filters." Naomi glanced at him briefly. "Consistency will matter more than symbolism," she said. He understood. Across the table, Richard reviewed an internal memo announcing a new executive accountability dashboard that would be accessible to board members and investors alike. Transparency was no longer abstract language. It was codified. As the session resumed, Naomi requested updated data projections for employee retention over the next quarter. "Cultural confidence stabilizes performance," she said calmly. "Stability protects capital." The board members nodded, recognizing the interconnected logic. Financial sustainability and ethical infrastructure were no longer presented as separate conversations. They were integrated. Meanwhile, media outlets continued analyzing the broader implications of the audit model. Business journals referenced Whitmore Industries as a case study in governance reform under investor oversight. Naomi declined interview requests once again. Her focus remained operational. As the afternoon light shifted toward gold, the review session concluded with a summarized action timeline for the next 30 days. Deadlines were set. Accountability checkpoints scheduled. Naomi stood slowly, gathering her folder with deliberate precision. "Progress is visible," she said evenly. "Maintain it." The room understood the weight behind the simple instruction. There was no applause this time. No spectacle. Only disciplined follow-through. As Naomi exited the building, the air outside carried a crisp hint of approaching winter. Pedestrians moved briskly along the sidewalks, unaware of the structural transformation unfolding above them. Her driver opened the car door, and she stepped inside without hurry. The city passed by in familiar rhythms, storefront lights flickering on as dusk approached. Daniel called again during the drive. 3 additional firms have initiated internal audits inspired by this framework, he reported. One has formally requested Carter global consultation. Naomi looked out the window at the moving skyline. "Structure scales," she replied. "Emotion does not." Back inside Whitmore headquarters, Richard remained at the conference table reviewing notes long after others had left. He understood now that the audit was not a concession. It was a recalibration. Victoria joined him quietly. "She did not humiliate us," she observed. Richard shook his head slightly. "She disciplined us," he corrected. Logan sat alone in his office across the hall, staring at the revised code of conduct posted on his internal screen. The language felt heavier now, not restrictive, anchoring. He remembered the tilt of the glass, the laughter, the silence. He remembered the moment the room shifted. That shift had not ended with a canceled partnership. It had expanded into systemic correction. The next morning, Whitmore Industries published its first transparency update to investors, outlining governance enhancements and early cultural metrics. Markets responded steadily. No dramatic spikes. No declines. Stability. Naomi reviewed the release from her office, scanning for clarity. The language held. No defensive undertones. No diluted responsibility. Just structured progress. She placed the document down and walked toward the window overlooking the Hudson River once more. The water moved in quiet currents beneath overcast skies. Power, she had always believed, did not need spectacle to endure. It required alignment. The red-stained dress remained preserved in her closet at home, no longer a reminder of disrespect, but of inflection. An inflection point that had extended beyond one evening into measurable institutional change. Her phone buzzed once more. A short message from Richard. "Executive dashboard is live. Public access begins tomorrow." Naomi allowed herself a brief nod. Transparency implemented. Accountability visible. The partnership had not only survived, it had matured. As the city settled into evening again, office lights flickering off floor by floor across Midtown, one truth continued to solidify beneath the skyline. Respect that is demanded is temporary. Respect that is structured becomes culture. And culture, once recalibrated, reshapes every room it enters. The real test is not the announcement. It is the aftermath. Naomi Carter said quietly 30 days into the 90-day cultural review as she stepped onto the stage of Whitmore Industries' Internal Leadership Summit. This was not a gala. There were no crystal chandeliers or orchestras. The auditorium inside Whitmore headquarters held 300 mid-level managers seated in structured rows beneath recessed lighting. Large screens displayed charts detailing governance metrics, response timelines, and leadership accountability dashboards. The atmosphere was attentive, disciplined, alert. Naomi stood at the podium in a navy-tailored suit, posture steady, presence composed. The red-stained white dress remained preserved at home, but its meaning had expanded beyond fabric. It had become framework. She looked out across the room and allowed a brief silence to settle before speaking again. 30 days ago, she continued evenly. This company committed to measurable alignment. The words were not dramatic. They were precise. Commitment, she added, is demonstrated through repetition. Behind her, a screen shifted to display updated transparency metrics. Complaint resolution timelines had decreased from 10 business days to 4. Executive review boards now included 2 independent oversight members. Internal surveys reflected a 35% increase in employee confidence regarding leadership accessibility. The data spoke clearly. Naomi did not embellish it. She let it stand. Richard Whitmore watched from the front row, hands folded calmly. Logan sat 2 seats to his right, expression attentive, shoulders squared but no longer rigid. Victoria reviewed the printed program beside them, listening closely. Naomi continued. Reform is not about image correction, she said. It is about structural reinforcement. She moved slightly away from the podium, stepping into open space at center stage. When leadership is visible, culture stabilizes. When accountability is measurable, trust compounds. The audience remained silent, absorbing each sentence. These were not abstract ideals. They were operational truths. A slide behind her displayed before and after comparisons of executive conduct clauses. Compensation metrics now tied directly to ethical compliance benchmarks. Incentives define behavior, Naomi said calmly. If integrity is not incentivized, it becomes optional. A few heads in the audience nodded. Not in performance, but in recognition. Logan felt the weight of the sentence personally. He had signed the revised compensation agreement himself. Behavior now carried tangible consequence. Naomi shifted the presentation toward case studies from Carter Global Holdings, illustrating how governance alignment had preceded long-term profitability in previous partnerships. Capital follows consistency, she said. Not charisma. The sentence hung clearly in the air. It was not directed at anyone specifically, but its implication was understood. After 40 minutes of structured presentation, Naomi paused and invited questions. A regional operations manager stood carefully. How do we ensure that this momentum does not fade after the 90-day mark? He asked. Naomi met his gaze directly. By embedding expectation into routine, she answered. Policy without practice dissolves. Another executive asked about cross-department accountability frameworks. Naomi responded with calm precision, outlining integrated review cycles and continuous feedback loops. Her tone never rose. It never softened. It remained disciplined. The summit concluded not with applause, but with action assignments distributed across departments. Implementation. Schedules were projected clearly on screen. Naomi stepped down from the stage, greeted by Richard with a firm handshake. The room is different now, he said quietly. Naomi glanced across the auditorium where managers were already gathering into working clusters. Rooms change when expectations do, she replied. Logan approached next. I will be speaking at the next session, he said. On executive responsibility. Naomi regarded him steadily. Speak with clarity, she answered. Not performance. He nodded once. The afternoon light filtered through the high windows of the auditorium as Naomi exited the building. Outside, the city felt crisp beneath a pale sky. Traffic moved steadily along the avenue, horns punctuating the rhythm of urban life. Her phone vibrated with a message from Daniel. Whitmore Governance Dashboard has exceeded investor transparency benchmarks. Naomi allowed herself a brief nod. Progress was no longer anecdotal. It was visible. That evening, financial news outlets published mid-review updates highlighting Whitmore Industries' accelerated governance reforms. Analysts noted increased investor stability and projected long-term resilience. Naomi reviewed the coverage briefly, then closed her laptop. Headlines mattered less than sustainability. Across town, Logan stood alone in his office preparing notes for his upcoming internal address. He stared at the revised executive conduct language displayed on his screen. The phrases no longer felt abstract. They felt instructive. He remembered the tilt of the glass, the laughter, the silence. He remembered how quickly the room had recalibrated when power shifted. That recalibration had not destroyed him. It had demanded growth. Richard entered quietly. "Leadership is not inherited," he said. Logan looked up. "It is earned," he finished softly. Richard nodded once. Meanwhile, Naomi stood at her apartment window overlooking the Hudson River once more. Evening light reflected across the water in steady waves. The 90-day timeline was halfway complete. Structural reform was measurable. Cultural recalibration was underway. She thought briefly of her father again, of the quiet dignity he carried even when rooms did not welcome him. That dignity had not demanded acknowledgement. It had endured. Her phone buzzed again. A message from a board chair at another major firm. "We would like to implement a similar framework before year-end." Naomi typed a concise response. "Structure requires commitment. Let us discuss readiness first." She set the phone down and allowed the city lights to fill the room. The red-stained dress remained in her closet, untouched, preserved not as a reminder of insult, but as a reminder of inflection. What began as a moment of disrespect had matured into a model of institutional discipline. The transformation had not required anger. It had required clarity. As Manhattan settled into another evening, office towers dimming floor by floor, the true shift was no longer visible only in dashboards or policy documents. It was visible in posture, in tone, in expectation. Leadership inside Whitmore Industries now carried different weight. Accountability was no longer reactive. It was routine. And as the skyline reflected across the dark water below, one truth remained anchored beneath the surface. When power chooses structure over spectacle, the aftermath becomes the legacy. Stability is the loudest proof of change. Naomi Carter said quietly 60 days into the 90-day review as she walked through the main operations floor of Whitmore Industries' Manhattan headquarters. The environment no longer carried the subtle tension that had defined the early audit sessions. Monitors displayed live project metrics. Team leads moved between desks with steady focus. Conversations were direct, structured, purposeful. What had once been centralized behind executive doors now flowed across transparent, reporting dashboards mounted along the glass walls. Naomi observed without interrupting. She did not arrive with entourage or announcement. Her presence alone carried enough gravity. Employees nodded respectfully as she passed, not with fear, but with recognition. Recognition that accountability had become routine. In a nearby conference room, Logan Whitmore stood before a group of junior managers delivering his first internal leadership address since the audit began. The room was simple. Fluorescent lighting. Rectangular tables arranged in a U shape. No stage. No projection spectacle. He spoke without notes. "Authority is not insulation," he said evenly. "It is exposure." The managers listened closely. Some had never heard him speak without inherited confidence. Now his tone carried deliberate humility. "When leadership fails to model respect," he continued, "it weakens the entire structure." He paused briefly before adding, "I learned that publicly." The room remained silent, absorbing the honesty. It was not theatrical confession. It was acknowledgement. Outside, Naomi continued walking through the operations floor, observing interaction patterns. She noted how supervisors addressed employees directly rather than through intermediaries. She watched as a compliance officer updated a dashboard in real time, metrics visible to all. Transparency had moved from concept to interface. Richard Whitmore joined her near the center of the floor. "You can feel the shift," he said quietly. Naomi glanced across the workspace where teams collaborated openly. "Culture stabilizes when expectations are clear," she replied. Richard nodded slowly. Investor confidence has held steady through the entire review period, he added. Analysts describe it as disciplined resilience. Naomi allowed a small nod. Resilience requires repetition, she said. Not reaction. Later that afternoon, a mid-review investor briefing convened inside the executive boardroom. Representatives from major capital firms joined via secure video feed. Charts projected measurable progress. Retention rates up 12%. Internal reporting compliance improved by 40%. Response times meeting or exceeding benchmarks across all divisions. Naomi sat beside Richard at the long, polished table, her posture composed, hands folded lightly before her. The audit has transitioned from corrective to preventive, she stated calmly during the presentation. What began as alignment verification is now structural integration. An investor from Chicago leaned forward on screen. Would you categorize the partnership as strengthened? He asked. Naomi considered the question carefully. It is recalibrated, she answered. Strength is sustained by recalibration. The distinction mattered. Strength implied static solidity. Recalibration implied ongoing refinement. As the briefing concluded, market summaries began circulating in real time. Stability maintained. Governance metrics exceeding expectations. Whitmore Industries stock reflected modest but consistent upward movement. No dramatic surges. No volatility. Just steadiness. That steadiness carried more weight than spectacle ever could. In a quiet moment after the briefing, Logan approached Naomi privately near the window overlooking the city. Afternoon sunlight reflected off distant skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the room. I understand something now that I did not before, he said. Naomi turned toward him, expression neutral. Understanding requires evidence, she replied. Logan nodded. Respect is not granted by title, he said slowly. It is practiced through behavior. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then inclined her head slightly. Continue practicing, she answered. There was no praise, only direction. Across the river, traffic moved steadily along the highways. Manhattan remained indifferent to internal transformation. Yet within corporate corridors, change had embedded itself into daily procedure. The audit dashboard now updated hourly. Executive performance reviews incorporated behavioral assessment metrics. Independent oversight members participated actively in leadership meetings. Victoria reviewed community engagement initiatives that aligned with the new accountability framework, ensuring external commitments matched internal standards. That evening, Naomi returned to her apartment overlooking the Hudson. The city lights shimmered across the water in familiar patterns. She removed her blazer and placed it carefully over a chair. The red-stained white dress still hung in her closet, untouched, preserved. It no longer symbolized disruption. It symbolized pivot. A pivot that had altered not only one partnership, but a broader industry expectation. Her phone buzzed softly. Daniel's voice came through when she answered. 90% of Whitmore's mid-level leadership has completed accountability certification modules, he reported. Feedback indicates strong internal buy-in. Naomi walked toward the window, looking out at the steady flow of traffic below. Momentum is real when it is voluntary, she replied. Not when it is mandated. Daniel paused. It appears voluntary, he said. She allowed a faint, satisfied nod. The review was nearing completion. What had begun as scrutiny had matured into system. The next morning, Whitmore Industries hosted a community town hall meeting streamed publicly, outlining progress and inviting questions from employees and stakeholders alike. Richard stood at the podium, but Logan spoke first. We were challenged, he said clearly, and challenge revealed our blind spots. The audience remained attentive. Naomi watched remotely from her office, observing tone and posture more than words. We are not finished, Logan continued. We are improving. The simplicity of the statement carried weight. It avoided triumph. It embraced continuation. As the town hall concluded, social media commentary shifted from skepticism to measured acknowledgement. Governance analysts cited Whitmore Industries as a model for responsive recalibration under investor oversight. Naomi closed the live stream window and turned her attention back to internal reports. She did not celebrate. She evaluated. The 90-day mark approached steadily. Structure had replaced assumption. Transparency had replaced insulation. Accountability had replaced ambiguity. That evening, she opened her closet briefly and looked at the preserved dress. The deep red stain remained vivid against white silk. She traced the edge of the fabric lightly with her fingertips, not in regret, but in recognition. That moment had not demanded retaliation. It had demanded resolve, and resolve had produced reform. Outside her window, the Hudson moved steadily beneath the night sky, reflecting lights from towers that seemed permanent, yet were built piece by piece over time. Change worked the same way. Quiet, structured, cumulative. As Manhattan settled into another restless night, one truth stood firm beneath the skyline. Respect that is tested becomes culture when leadership chooses structure over pride. And culture, once aligned with principle, does not revert easily. It endures. Completion does not mean conclusion. Naomi Carter said quietly on the morning of the 90th day as she entered Whitmore Industries headquarters for the final review presentation. The sky above Manhattan was clear and sharp, autumn light reflecting off the glass towers with crisp precision. Traffic moved steadily along the avenue below, horns muted by distance, the city operating with its usual indifference to corporate transformation. Inside the executive boardroom, the long polished table was prepared with final audit binders, each embossed with the date and the words Governance Integration Review. Richard Whitmore stood as Naomi entered, not out of ceremony, but out of acknowledgement. Logan and Victoria followed. Board members from Chicago, Houston, and San Francisco joined via secure video screens mounted along the far wall. The room carried no tension now. It carried focus. Naomi took her seat at the head of the table, posture composed, expression steady. Daniel connected from Carter Global Holdings, projecting the final metrics summary onto the central display. Charts filled the screen in clear columns. Complaint resolution timeline stabilized at 3 business days. Executive accountability metrics fully integrated into compensation structures. Employee retention increased 18% since the review began. Independent oversight participation normalized across leadership meetings. The numbers did not fluctuate wildly. They aligned. Naomi folded her hands lightly before her. 90 days ago, she began evenly. Alignment was conditional. Her voice did not rise. It did not soften. It remained precise. Today, alignment is operational. The statement settled across the room with measured weight. Richard nodded once, his posture reflective rather than defensive. Logan listened with the quiet attention of someone who understood that this outcome had required more than policy change. It had required recalibration of behavior. Naomi continued, turning a page in the binder before her. Transparency has transitioned from announcement to routine, she said. Accountability has moved from reactive to embedded. A board member from Houston leaned toward his microphone. Would you characterize this partnership as fully restored? He asked carefully. Naomi paused, not for drama, but for accuracy. Restoration implies return, she replied. This is progression. The distinction carried clarity. What existed now was not what existed before the gala. It was stronger because it had been examined. Daniel advanced the presentation to the final slide. Governance compliance certification, achieved. Independent oversight integration, permanent. Quarterly transparency reporting, scheduled. Naomi looked around the room slowly, meeting. Each gaze without intensity, without accusation. This review concludes today, she said. The framework continues. Silence followed, not uncertain, but reflective. Richard stood. On behalf of Whitmore Industries, I acknowledge the discipline this process required, he said, and the clarity it produced. Victoria nodded in agreement. Logan rose as well. Accountability changed more than our metrics, he said evenly. It changed our leadership posture. Naomi regarded him for a moment, then inclined her head slightly. Posture determines direction, she replied. Outside the boardroom windows, sunlight reflected off the neighboring towers, bright and steady. The city did not celebrate. It did not pause. It continued. Inside the room, however, a structural shift had solidified. Richard extended his hand across the table. Naomi stood and shook it firmly. Not as concession, not as spectacle, as confirmation. The partnership had matured. After the formal session concluded, the board dispersed gradually. Conversations focused on forward strategy rather than corrective measures. Investors joined a brief virtual press update where Richard announced the successful completion of the Governance Integration Review. Naomi stood beside him, silent but present. We committed to measurable accountability, Richard stated clearly. We have achieved it. Journalists asked about long-term implications. Naomi answered one question directly. Sustainable capital requires sustainable culture, she said. No embellishment. No narrative flourish. Just principle. The update concluded without applause. It ended with affirmation. As Naomi exited the building later that afternoon, the autumn air carried a subtle chill. Pedestrians crossed intersections beneath amber traffic lights. The world outside moved without awareness of the structural recalibration finalized upstairs. Her driver opened the car door, and she entered calmly. During the drive downtown, Daniel called. The markets have responded steadily, he reported. No volatility. Investor confidence is consistent. Naomi looked out the window at the skyline slipping past. Consistency is the goal, she replied. Back at her apartment overlooking the Hudson River, evening lights stretched across the water in long silver lines. She removed her blazer and placed it neatly on a chair. The 90-day review had concluded. The framework endured. She walked toward her closet and opened the door slowly. The white silk dress still hung in its protective cover, the red stain preserved, undiminished. She touched the fabric lightly, not to erase it, but to remember. That single moment had not defined her. It had revealed a system. And systems, when examined, can be rebuilt. Her phone buzzed softly with a message from Richard. Governance dashboard archived as permanent structure. Naomi typed a brief reply. Maintain vigilance. She closed the closet door and walked toward the window once more. The Hudson flowed steadily beneath the fading light, indifferent yet constant. In offices across Manhattan, executives reviewed the finalized governance framework as a template for their own institutions. What had begun as a private inflection had matured into public precedent. Naomi stood in silence, hands resting lightly against the cool glass. Power had not shouted. It had structured. Dignity had not retaliated. It had recalibrated. And as the city lights flickered on one by one across the skyline, a quiet truth settled beneath them. Completion is not the end of accountability. It is the beginning of expectation. Legacy is not what you inherit. It is what you correct. Naomi Carter said softly one week after the completion of the 90-day governance review as she stood before a packed auditorium at the National Infrastructure Leadership Forum in Washington, District of Columbia. The room held executives from across the country, federal policy advisors, venture capital leaders, and emerging entrepreneurs seated beneath warm recessed lighting. Large American flags stood quietly at either side of the stage. The skyline beyond the conference center windows reflected a late afternoon sun, casting long lines of gold across polished floors. Naomi stood centered at the podium, posture steady, presence controlled. The journey from a single private moment to a national case study had not been theatrical. It had been structural. She looked across the audience and allowed silence to settle before continuing. In business, she said evenly, we often measure growth in dollars, in miles of infrastructure, in quarterly percentages. But growth without examination becomes fragility. The words carried without force, without accusation. They carried clarity. Screens behind her displayed anonymized governance integration metrics drawn from multiple firms that had adopted similar frameworks following Whitmore Industries' review. Transparency benchmarks increased across sectors. Executive accountability clauses became industry standard language. Internal escalation timelines shortened nationwide. What had once been an isolated recalibration now influenced broader corporate architecture. Naomi did not mention the gala. She did not reference the stain preserved in her closet overlooking the Hudson River. She did not need to. The inflection had matured into framework. True strength, she continued calmly, is not demonstrated when everything runs smoothly. It is demonstrated when something unexpected reveals your structure. In the front row, Richard Whitmore listened attentively, hands folded, expression reflective rather than proud. Logan sat 2 seats away, posture grounded, no longer insulated by inherited certainty. Victoria watched with quiet composure. Naomi stepped slightly away from the podium, her voice measured and consistent. The question is never whether a company will face scrutiny, she said. The question is whether its leadership is prepared to transform scrutiny into discipline. The audience remained silent, absorbing the weight of the principle. A federal advisor leaned forward slightly, Pen paused above notebook paper. Naomi continued. When capital aligns with culture, sustainability follows. When dignity aligns with policy, resilience follows. She allowed a brief pause. And when accountability becomes routine, legacy becomes durable. Applause began softly, then steadied. Not explosive. Intentional. Naomi inclined her head in acknowledgement and stepped back from the podium. The forum moderator approached to thank her, but she simply nodded and returned to her seat. The influence of the review had expanded beyond one partnership. It had shifted expectation across boardrooms nationwide. Later that evening, Naomi walked alone along the Potomac River before her return flight to New York. The air carried a light autumn chill. Streetlights reflected in the water, long and steady. She considered how easily the moment at the gala could have taken a different path. Retaliation, public spectacle, withdrawal of capital. Instead, discipline had restructured alignment. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Daniel. 3 additional corporations have requested long-term governance partnership consultations. Naomi typed a brief reply. Schedule readiness evaluations first. Structure before expansion. She slipped the phone back into her coat pocket and continued walking. Back in Manhattan, Whitmore Industries released its first quarterly transparency report under the new framework. Markets responded with stable confidence. Analysts described the company as a benchmark for integrated accountability. Logan stood in his office reviewing the report, pausing over sections detailing executive conduct adherence metrics. He understood now that leadership was not insulation from consequence. It was exposure to expectation. Richard entered quietly. "You have handled the transition well," he said to his son. Logan looked up. "I had to learn publicly," he replied. Richard nodded once. "Public lessons endure," he said. Meanwhile, Naomi returned to her apartment overlooking the Hudson River. The city skyline shimmered beneath nightfall, steady and familiar. She removed her coat and placed it carefully on a chair before. Walking toward the window, the river moved with quiet persistence, unaffected by headlines or forums. She opened her closet once more, looking briefly at the preserved white silk dress with its deep red stain. She no longer saw interruption. She saw catalyst. That catalyst had not demanded volume. It had required resolve. She closed the closet door gently and returned to the window. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Richard. "Thank you for insisting on discipline over pride." Naomi read the message carefully before responding. Discipline protects everyone. She placed the phone down and allowed silence to fill the room. Across the skyline, lights blinked on in office towers where executives reviewed policy drafts inspired by the governance model. In conference rooms across the country, leadership teams examined accountability dashboards and asked harder questions than they had before. The ripple continued outward, not because of outrage, but because of structure. Naomi rested her hands lightly against the cool glass of the window. The Hudson reflected the city in steady lines of light. Power had not needed to shout. It had needed to endure. And endurance had produced evolution. Weeks later, during a quiet internal meeting at Carter Global Holdings, Daniel summarized the long-term impact. "What began as conditional alignment has now become industry expectation," he said. Naomi nodded once. "Expectation shapes culture," she replied. "Culture shapes legacy." The red-stained dress remained preserved, not as a symbol of humiliation, but as evidence that dignity under pressure can reconstruct systems. Outside, Manhattan continued its restless rhythm. Traffic moved at predictable intervals. Bridges carried steady streams of headlights across the river. The world did not pause to mark transformation. It simply absorbed it. And in that absorption, one final truth settled quietly across boardrooms and skylines alike. Respect is not secured by dominance. It is secured by discipline. And discipline, once demonstrated, becomes the standard every room must meet.